When Jesus was about to leave this earth and return to heaven, he instructed his disciples to do the work of making disciples. Matthew chapter 28 and verses 18 through 20 reads, "And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and lo, I am always with you, even to the end of the age. Amen." The work of Jesus' disciples, making disciples of others, was on the forefront of Jesus' mind at this time. He was no longer going to be on this earth and to continue the work himself. It was now being entrusted to a handful of disciples to complete the greatest mission that had ever been given to mankind. They were to carry the saving message of the gospel throughout the entire world so that others would become disciples of Jesus Christ and be saved from their sins. So these early disciples went about accomplishing this work. The result was twofold. First, the saving message of the gospel was preached throughout the known world. About 30 years after Jesus' commission, the Apostle Paul wrote concerning the gospel and said that it was preached to every creature under heaven, Colossians 1 verse 23. Second, disciples of Jesus Christ multiplied. For instance, Acts chapter 6 and verse 7 says, "Then the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith." This work of making disciples has been passed on to those who are Jesus' disciples today. There is still a great need for every person on this earth to hear the saving message of the gospel and become disciples of Christ. So those who claim to be Jesus' disciples today must honestly consider if they are devoted to this work. In this series of lessons, the goal is to help those who truly desire to be disciples of Christ learn about making disciples for Christ. This first study aims to introduce the concept of disciple-making disciples. In order to please Christ in your discipleship, you must recognize that the work of making disciples is involved. So we will consider that disciples should work to make disciples. Then we will consider that disciple makers should be disciples. And we will consider the need for spiritual mentors. First, recognize that disciples should work to make disciples. Disciples of Jesus Christ should be disciple makers. To help us recognize this, understand that there are two things involved in being a disciple. First, a disciple is a pupil or a student who is committed to learning from a master. Second, a disciple imitates the master. So those who are disciples of Christ must be diligent to learn from and imitate the master, that is, Jesus Christ. This will certainly have a tremendous impact on disciples working to make disciples for Jesus. Let's begin by learning from Jesus' example. When he lived on this earth, he had a great mission to fulfill. Namely, he was committed to accomplishing his Father's mission of providing himself as the ransom sacrifice for the sins of the world. And then, as he went through his earthly ministry, this work obviously included teaching and calling people to become his disciples so that they would be saved. Luke 19 and verse 10 says, "For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost." Jesus worked to make disciples of any who would listen to him. Sometimes he taught great multitudes who had gathered. Sometimes he taught one-on-one. Sometimes he taught a small group of people. Regardless of the circumstance, his interest was in helping others learn how to follow him, both by giving instruction and by providing the perfect example to follow. Matthew chapter 4 and verses 18 to 22 describes Jesus calling 4 fishermen to be his disciples. It says, "And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw 2 brothers, Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him." Peter, Andrew, James, and John are all responded to Jesus' invitation to be his disciples by following him. From this time, Jesus continued working with these 4 men to train them for the work of making disciples of others. Notice that Jesus was going to use the abilities of these men to be fishers of men. They were not highly skilled or educated individuals, but Jesus was going to work with them closely so that they would be able to carry on his work without him. For instance, after Jesus ascended into heaven and had commissioned his disciples to go and make disciples, Peter and John had the opportunity to preach in Acts chapters 3 and 4 after healing a paralyzed man. When they were brought before the highest Jewish court, that is the Sanhedrin, the people in the court, in Acts 4 verse 13, saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated and untrained men, and they marveled. And they realized that they had been with Jesus. They could see that these men had no exceptional background that would qualify them to have such a great impact on people. But they realized that Peter and John had been with Jesus. And this was all they needed. As Jesus worked to teach those who wanted to follow him by example and instruction, he prepared them to carry on this work without him. You can read through the gospel records of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to see how Jesus worked diligently to make disciples out of these and others, especially noting the frequent mentions of Peter, James, and John. It only stands to reason that a work that was so important to Jesus would be carried on after he ascended into heaven. So there are many references in the scriptures that indicate the necessity of Jesus' disciples working to make disciples for Jesus. You simply cannot separate being a disciple from the work of making disciples. The earliest disciples of Jesus recognized that they were expected to be about the work of making disciples. Consider the Great Commission Jesus gave directly to his disciples, particularly to his apostles. Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20 says, "And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, 'All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Amen.'" In Mark 16, verses 15 and 16, it says, "And he said to them, 'Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned.'" Luke chapter 24, verses 46 through 49 says, "Then he said to them, 'Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer, and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And you are witnesses of these things. Behold, I send the promise of my Father upon you, but tarry in the city of Jerusalem until you are endued with power from on high.'" Acts chapter 1, verse 8 says, "But you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth." Clearly, They were to take the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ into all the world, beginning at Jerusalem. It was not enough just for Jesus to have a handful of disciples. For if the gospel was not spread throughout the world and disciples did not multiply, then how would people learn of their opportunity to be saved from their sins through Jesus Christ? Christianity would just die out. After Jesus ascended into heaven and the Holy Spirit came upon the apostles in Acts 1 and 2, these first disciples began their work of making disciples. The apostles preached the gospel in Acts 2, and about 3,000 people were added to the number of disciples, as you see in verse 41. The number came to be about 5,000 in Acts 4 and verse 4. In Acts 5, believers were increasingly added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women, verse 14. The number of the disciples was multiplying in Acts 6 and verse 1. And as the word of God spread, the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, Acts 6 and verse 7. And then Acts 8 and verse 4, whenever persecution forced the disciples to leave Jerusalem, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word, so that the word was taken into other parts of the earth. Acts 9 and verse 31 says, Then the churches throughout all Judea, Galilee, and Samaria had peace and were edified, and walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, they were multiplied. The word continued spreading, and the number of disciples multiplied. Jesus' plan of his disciples working to make disciples who would work to make disciples was working, as God's plans always do. The number of disciples was multiplying throughout the earth. But it is important for disciples today to stop and recognize that this work was not reserved just for the apostles or highly skilled workers in Christ's kingdom. As we saw in Acts 8 and verse 4, all the disciples who were scattered were about the work of preaching the word wherever they went. Consider a couple of passages that describe the work of making disciples. First, consider Romans chapter 10, verses 13 through 15. It says, For whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, How beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who bring glad tidings of good things. Today, there continues to be those who need to call on the name of the Lord to be saved, just as all those who are now disciples once needed to do. And just like those who are disciples needed to have someone preach the gospel to them so that they could hear, believe, and obey its message, there are many people, disciples of Christ, come into contact with who need the same thing. Now, those who are disciples must recognize that it is their work to help other people be disciples of Jesus Christ. Second, consider 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2. The Apostle Paul told Timothy, And the things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Later in the chapter, Paul wrote in verses 24 through 26, And a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patient, in humility correcting those who are in opposition, if God perhaps will grant them repentance so that they may know the truth and that they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. Jesus has ascended into heaven and committed the work of making disciples to his disciples. The early disciples who accomplished this work so well have died. Now, the work of making disciples belongs to those who are Jesus' disciples today. Jesus still expects that those who have had the saving message of the gospel entrusted to them committed to others, who will also be able to teach others. Notice that a servant of the Lord must be able to teach and help correct those who are in opposition to God learn the truth so as to escape Satan's traps. Therefore, if you are a disciple of Christ, you are charged with the work of making disciples. Just like those who are real fishermen fish, real disciples work to make disciples of others. Just ask yourself, am I really a true disciple of Jesus Christ? If I do not listen to Jesus' teaching to make disciples, or follow Jesus' example of making disciples, surely if those who claim to be disciples of Jesus are not committed to the work of making disciples, they need to listen to Jesus' question in Luke 6 and verse 46. He says, "But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things which I say?" Now, as you think about the work that you have been given to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ so as to make disciples for Jesus, you must recognize that the goal is to make disciples. This needs to be emphasized and really understood because I think there are many Christians who get the focus all wrong. Some people are only focused on giving other people information. Some people are only focused on winning religious arguments. Some people are only focused on baptizing others. Some people are only focused on getting more people into a church building. Some people are only focused on building a following for themselves. But the goal of the Great Commission is to go and make disciples of all the nations, Matthew 28, verse 19. Now, it is certainly true that passing on information, specifically the gospel of Jesus Christ, is essential to this task. This work necessarily includes baptizing people, and this work will result in more people being part of local churches. Yet, let me explain how the goals that I previously mentioned fall short of Christ's true goal. Some of them are obvious. For instance, we must never be interested in building a following for ourselves or in numbers for the sake of numbers. But what about the others? The end goal is not just to give people information, because it is possible to pass along information, even the saving message of the gospel, in a way that does not help people become disciples. It may be that the message is taught with such a lack of love and concern for the one being taught that the individual is driven away from Christ. Although it is true that you can only plant and water God's word in the hearts of others, and you cannot control the result, as you can see in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 6, you must teach it in the right kind of way. The end goal also is not winning arguments. Similar to the last point, you may conduct yourself in such a way that you win the intellectual argument and lose the soul. Your interest must not be to prove that you know the truth, but to help others believe and obey it. And the end goal is not even baptizing people. While being baptized is a necessary part of becoming a disciple, there are those who teach and baptize people and then leave them without helping them develop into growing disciples. For those who accept the gospel initially and become disciples by being baptized must continue to learn from Jesus and become more like him. The true goal is to make disciples. And to be a true disciple, Jesus said that he must come first. Luke 14, verse 26 says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, in his own life also, he cannot be my disciple." Luke 14, verse 27 says, "And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." And verse 33 says, "So likewise whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple." So as you work to do what Jesus desires, your focus, or you must focus on helping other people be true disciples of Jesus Christ. Everything you tell them must be focused on this goal. Your example must be focused on this goal. How you interact with them must be focused on this goal. For unless someone becomes a true disciple of Jesus Christ, by committing himself or herself fully to following the Lord in all things, he or she will not be saved, as Jesus taught in Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. Well, as you think about the work of making disciples, you should clearly understand that disciple makers should be disciples themselves. Although this point should go without saying, it needs to be emphasized because of the great danger that is posed by those who are not truly disciples. So, before you go about the work of making disciples, you should evaluate yourself. Here is how Jesus refers to those who are his disciples. Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. As we have seen, true disciples are entirely committed to learning from and imitating Jesus Christ in their own lives. This kind of life will truly stand out from the world. They will be like salt that seasons a world full of bitterness and light in a world full of darkness. But true disciples don't just stand out from the world. Instead, as we have seen, true disciples multiply. So the salt tries to season the sinful world so that it will become acceptable to Christ. The light tries to shine on those in darkness so that they can come out of sin. Jesus says that those who are disciples of his will be spreading their influence so that others may also come to glorify the Father in heaven. Only true disciples will be able to accomplish this. Those who truly follow the Lord themselves will be able to teach other people what they need to know to follow Christ and show them what living for Christ looks like. So those who are lost in sin can recognize their need to come to the Lord for salvation in part through the godly example of disciples. Maybe they will want to know more about following Christ. Maybe they will begin imitating Christ by imitating the example of one of Christ's disciples. Or maybe it will just give you the right opportunity to talk with others about following Christ. Think about it this way. If you wanted help losing weight, would you go to a so-called dietitian who was overweight? If you wanted financial help, would you go to someone who is broke? If you wanted marital help, would you go to someone who has a terrible marriage? If not, why not? In the same way, people who are interested in following Jesus Christ will not want to be taught to be disciples by someone who is not truly a disciple. So, in order for you to have the greatest opportunity to influence others to be disciples of Christ, you must be a disciple. And therefore, 2 Corinthians 13 verse 5 says, examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you are disqualified. Just think about the dangers that are posed by those who are not true disciples as they work to make disciples. First, you may be thinking, why would someone who is not a true disciple try to make disciples? There may be many answers. Some have selfish motives in seeking financial gain, a following for themselves, wanting to make themselves look good, etc. Some have deceived themselves into thinking that they are true disciples while they're actually living in sin, like Jesus described in Matthew 7, verses 21 to 23. Some have been deceived by others into thinking that they are disciples of Jesus, while they do not actually obey what Jesus instructs. Regardless, consider what Jesus asked in Matthew 5 and verse 13 again. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. So, if those who are supposed to be Jesus' disciples do not actually follow Jesus, their influence does not actually accomplish the good in the world that Jesus intended. For example, some who claim to be Jesus' disciples are hypocrites. They act the part of being a disciple on occasion, but do not always follow him with love and sincerity. For instance, although they did not claim to be disciples of Jesus, the Jewish leaders claimed to follow God and led people into error through their hypocrisy. Concerning them, in Matthew 23, verses 2 through 4, Jesus said, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works. For they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." We simply will not be successful in making disciples of Christ by only playing Christian. If people see that you are not doing the things that you are telling them they should be doing, you will be like the salt that becomes worthless. Even more, not only will you hinder people from following Christ, but you may do great damage to the cause of Christ and those who are interested in following him. For example, one of the top reasons people give for not joining a church is because of the hypocrisy of the members. Why should people want to listen to you and allow you the opportunity to influence them if they see you living in sinful ways? And why should they have any interest in listening to God if you are living for sin? And then those who are not true disciples of Christ can also harm people and the cause of Christ by making others who are just like them rather than like Christ. For instance, hypocrites may make other hypocrites. Lukewarm followers of Christ who are not entirely devoted to him may make other lukewarm followers of Christ. Those who have believed a false gospel may spread their false gospel even further. I believe that Jesus recognized this whenever he addressed some lukewarm followers and said in Revelation 3, verses 15 and 16, "I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I could wish you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth." I truly believe that it would be better for people to be all the way against Jesus than for people to be lukewarm. I believe that lukewarm and pretend disciples of Christ do more damage to the cause of Christ than those who are openly and aggressively working against Christ. A big part of this damage is caused by how they influence others to follow in the same wicked ways. And therefore, if you wish to be a disciple of Christ and make disciples, you must determine to be all the way for Christ. Now, let's think about the need for spiritual mentors. Discipleship is similar to our idea of mentorship. People often talk about having mentors in their profession. This is someone who really helped them learn a certain trade and become proficient in it. And whenever they run into difficulties, they ask their mentors for help. Yet, while the Bible does not use the word mentor, the concept certainly is used. Jesus wants his disciples to help others become and live as disciples. Jesus wants his disciples to multiply. I'm afraid that many disciples of Christ today have missed the biblical concept of making disciples of others. I'm afraid that it is far too uncommon for new disciples to be added to the Lord. But while the Bible does use the language of people being added to the church, such as in Acts 2 and verse 47, it also commonly uses the language of multiplication. Think back over what we have already considered on this. Acts 6 and verse 1 says, the number of the disciples was multiplying. Acts 6 and verse 7 says that the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem. Acts 9 and verse 31 says that the churches throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria were multiplied. And Acts 12 and verse 24 says that the word of God grew and multiplied. Now, why is it important to see that the number of disciples was multiplying rather than just disciples being added? Multiplication increases in multiples. So 6 plus 6 equals 12. But 6 times 6 equals 36 because it is 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6. It is exponential growth. And Jesus recognized that this was the best way for his kingdom to grow. It's like compounding interest in a retirement fund. Rather than just getting back a return on the initial amount that's invested, compounding interest gives you a return on the initial principal plus the additional interest that has been gained. Think about how 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2 explains this process in disciple making. Once again, it says, "And the things which you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." The Apostle Paul taught Timothy. So Paul helped Timothy live as a disciple. That kind of growth in the kingdom was good, but that is not where it was to stop. Now, Timothy was to go out and find other people he could help be disciples. Suppose he found 10 during his lifetime. Now, I have no way of knowing how many disciples Timothy helped to make. Then, suppose that these 10 would go out and each help 10 other people be disciples. Now, you would have 100 disciples. Then, suppose those 100 would each go out and help 10 people become disciples. Now, you would have 1,000 disciples. Then, suppose those 1,000 would each go out and help 10 people be disciples. Now, you would have 10,000. Then suppose those 10,000 would each go out and help 10 people be disciples. Now you would have 100,000 disciples. And then suppose those 100,000 disciples each go out and help 10 people be disciples. Now you would have 1,000,000 disciples. Now, this is purely an illustration, but it does help you to appreciate the multiplication that happens whenever disciples make disciples who make disciples. From starting with a single disciple, in that illustration, it was the Apostle Paul, working with a single person, Timothy, could result in this great growth in the number of disciples. And the more disciples who make disciples, the greater growth the kingdom will experience, potentially. Of course, this is all dependent upon people believing and obeying the message of the gospel. Now, think about some stages of spiritual maturity. Whenever you first become a disciple of Christ, you are like a newborn baby, spiritually. You are immature and weak in the faith. You need someone to serve as a mentor for you so that you can increase in your knowledge and learn about what it means to live as a Christian. But as you grow and mature in the faith, you should lean on your mentor or mentors less and less. And you should start becoming a mentor of others. Perhaps you can only help one person at first. Then maybe you can help a few. Then perhaps you can help an even greater number of people. Listen to Hebrews 5, verses 12 to 14. It says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. God knows you are not spiritually full grown the moment you become a disciple. He knows that you only have a basic understanding of His Word, that is, the milk of the Word. But He does expect you to begin a process of spiritual growth and maturity, as you can see in 2 Peter 3 and verse 18. You need to be weaned off the milk and progress to an increasingly deeper understanding of God's Word. As you do this, you will become more and more equipped to help other people follow Christ. However, there is a problem whenever disciples do not make this progression. Sometimes they become disciples and never get off the milk of the Word. So they continue to act like spiritual babies and do not increase in their abilities to help other people be disciples. But this ought not to be so. Listen to the stages of growth that the Apostle John seems to address in 1 John 2, verses 12 through 14. It says, I write to you, little children, because your sins are forgiven for His name's sake. I write to you, fathers, because you have known Him who is from the beginning. I write to you, young men, because you have overcome the wicked one. I write to you, little children, because you have known the Father. I have written to you, fathers, because you have known Him who is from the beginning. I have written to you, young men, because you are strong, and the word of God abides in you, and you have overcome the wicked one. It may be that John has designated 3 stages of growth for disciples in this text: little children, young men, and fathers. The first stage would be one of spiritual immaturity. The second would progress into greater spiritual knowledge and strength. The third would indicate a place of great spiritual maturity. And each step along this spiritual path should result in a greater ability to mentor others to be disciples of Christ, reaching the point you are a father, so to speak, to someone else in the faith, not in the sense of having a special title or authority over another, but only in the sense that Paul called Timothy a true son in the faith in 1 Timothy 1 and verse 2. And thus, you should grow in your faith to the point that your faith can multiply. Now, disciples should mentor others into discipleship. Look at the stages of the Great Commission as recorded in Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20 again. Jesus said to go and make disciples of all the nations. This involves baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and then continuing to teach them all things He commanded. So, disciples of Christ must take a big picture approach in helping others be disciples. It's not a short process. Just as someone, or perhaps several people, have helped and continue to help you be a disciple of Christ, you should do your part in helping people be disciples of Christ throughout their lives. This means doing the initial teaching whenever it is needed, helping people be baptized whenever that is needed, and continuing to teach them whenever they have reached that point. But every step of the way, you are striving to help people be disciples of Jesus Christ. You are both providing the necessary instruction and the proper example to help people follow Jesus Christ, just like Paul, who said in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. As we close, if you are a true disciple of Jesus Christ, you will be working to make disciples for Christ. You will be sincerely following Jesus Christ in your own life, and you will be looking for opportunities to help others do the same. Now, recognizing this truth, the remainder of the study will try and help you learn and encourage you to accomplish this work.